The air over the valley that morning carried the particular stillness of a held breath, and the people gathered outside the grain co-op on the edge of Colton Flats did not quite know what to do with their hands. They stood in the shade of the corrugated tin overhang, 12 or 15 of them, farmers and their wives, and a few idlers who had no real stake but could smell that something consequential was about to happen. And they looked at the woman standing in the bed of a sun-bleached pickup truck with a clipboard pressed to her chest, and the expression of someone who had already decided what she was going to say before anyone had finished asking. The valley floor was cracked and pale, and the creek that ran along the base of the eastern ridge had shrunk to a brown thread in its bed. The alfalfa fields were the color of old straw. 3 weeks of heat had done what 3 months of drought had started, and the livestock operations up and down the road were bleeding feed costs that nobody had budgeted for, because nobody had believed back in April that this summer would be the kind people would still be naming 20 years later. Everybody had cut hay. They had all cut it early, because the forecast said dry and hot, and the windows looked good, and because that was what you did when the weather cooperated. You moved fast, and you banked the tonnage, and you figured the rest would sort itself out. Only it had not sorted itself. The second cutting had come in thin and scorched. The third had not come in at all, and the stockpiles that should have seen these operations through to October were already at the bottom of the barrel in late July. So they were gathered outside the co-op with their hats in their hands, some of them literally, waiting on a woman who had sold them nothing and owed them nothing to decide whether she was going to help them, and on what terms, and whether the terms would be terms they could live with. Leon Hatter from the co-op board stood at the front of the loose half-circle of people, and he was not comfortable, which was itself a thing worth noting, because Leon Hatter was usually very comfortable. He cleared his throat. He said her name. She looked at him with steady brown eyes, and she did not say anything yet, and the hush that followed was so complete that you could hear the distant complaint of a red-tailed hawk circling the ridge. What happened next had been written, though none of them knew it, in the contours of the sky 8 weeks earlier, and it had been written considerably longer than that in the patience of one woman who had gotten very, very good at reading what the clouds were saying before anyone else thought to look up. That woman was Clara Voss, and she had come to Colton Flats 11 months before any of this, in the first week of September the previous year, in a truck with 200,000 miles on the odometer and a trailer behind it holding everything she owned, which did not amount to very much. She was 34 years old, and she had spent the previous 4 years working as a field technician for an agricultural extension service 3 states east, doing soil sampling and pasture assessment, and the kind of observational grunt work that no one thanked you for, but that taught you, if you were paying attention, more about how land actually behaved than any textbook ever printed. She had saved carefully. She had a figure in her head, a hard floor below which she would not go, and she had identified the parcel on Colton Flats Road through a county land sale listing that other people had skimmed past because the property description was not flattering. 82 acres, improvements described as modest, seasonal access road, and then the line that made other buyers move on, existing hay operation, current harvest yield significantly below county average. That was the phrase that sent people elsewhere. It was the phrase that brought Clara Voss here. She paid $31,000 for the property, which was almost precisely what she had saved in 4 years of meticulous living, and she did it in cash because a bank would not have looked at that yield history with any enthusiasm. She kept $1,100 in the account afterward, which was enough to get through a month if nothing broke, and nothing about the property suggested that nothing would break. The previous owner had farmed it the same way for 30 years, which is to say he had fought it. He had planted the same grass varieties that his father had planted, timed his cuttings to the county extension calendar rather than to the particular rhythms of this particular ground, and applied water and amendment according to schedules designed for valley floor conditions, that this parcel, sitting at the eastern edge of the valley where the terrain tilted and the drainage ran differently, simply did not share. The land had been tolerating this treatment for 3 decades with the stoic indifference of something that knows it will outlast whatever is being done to it. The hay it produced was thin and average and dependably unimpressive. Clara Voss had read all of this in the soil cores and the topography and the drainage maps she had studied for 2 weeks before she made her offer, and she thought she understood something that the listing price confirmed nobody else had understood. This ground was not failing. It was being asked to do the wrong thing in the wrong way, and it had been answering that request honestly for 30 years. The people of Colton Flats formed their first opinion of Clara Voss at the feed store in October, 6 weeks after she arrived. She came in for a load of organic soil amendment, which was not what people in Colton Flats typically bought, and she asked the man at the counter about hydrological survey records for the Eastern Ridge drainage, which was not a question people in Colton Flats typically asked. Word moved, the way it moves in small places, and the word was that the woman who bought the Tremblay place was doing something peculiar with it and probably didn't know what she was doing. This assessment hardened in November when she did not cut her remaining standing hay before the first frost, which every sensible operator in the valley did, and instead left it in place, which nobody did, because leaving it looked wasteful, and because convention said it was wasteful, and convention in Colton Flats had been accruing interest for 40 years. A man named Dale Pritchard, who ran 400 acres of hay ground north of the road and had opinions on everything, told anyone who would listen that the woman up at the Tremblay place was going to learn a hard lesson before spring. He said it in the feed store and at the diner and at the monthly Watershed Association meeting, and he said it with the particular relish of someone who already considers the lesson delivered. Martin Galt arrived in November as well. He represented, though he represented it with a careful vagueness, a consortium called High Plains Ag Partners, which held interests in grain storage and feed operations across 3 counties, and which had been quietly acquiring distressed agricultural parcels for 7 years. He was a trim man in his late 50s who wore good boots and a canvas ranch coat that had been purchased rather than worn in, and he shook Clara's hand in the yard with the warm solicitousness of someone who had practiced warmth until it was fluent. He said he had heard she was new to the area, and he wanted to make sure she knew the landscape, so to speak, and he hoped she was settling in all right. He looked at the field with an expression that a less observant person might have read as casual interest, and that Clara read as appraisal. He said that High Plains Ag had been considering whether a parcel like this one might fit into a consolidation they were working on, nothing urgent, just a thought, and that if she ever found herself in a position where the operation wasn't quite working out the way she had hoped, she should feel free to reach out, because they paid fair prices and they understood that sometimes a property just didn't suit its owner. He named a figure. It was $34,000. It was precisely enough to recover her purchase price and nothing else, the kind of offer that dressed itself as generosity by returning what you'd spent while erasing the 11 months of labor and the specific knowledge of the land that she had been quietly accumulating. She thanked him for stopping by and said she was not in that position. He said the offer would remain open and drove away in a truck that was considerably newer than hers. The winter was cold and clear, and she spent it doing what she had come to do, which was listen. She walked the property in the mornings before the light was full, in the long blue hour when the ground was still frozen, and the shapes of drainage and grade showed clearly in the frost patterns, and she carried a small notebook in which she recorded what she observed: where the runoff pooled when the snow melted, which corners of the pasture greened earliest in the weeks of false spring, where the grasses that had survived without irrigation were the thickest and most vigorous, and what the clouds above the eastern ridge were doing in the hour before weather changed. That last practice was the one she had started years earlier during her extension work, when an old soil scientist named Augustin Brier had told her that the sky above a particular piece of ground will tell you things about that ground's moisture budget that no instrument will tell you as early if you know what signs to watch for. She had taken him seriously because he was the kind of person it paid to take seriously, and she had been watching skies ever since with the attentive patience of someone who had accepted that the information came in its own time and on its own terms. She met Marta Oldhaven in December, on a morning when the temperature was somewhere south of reasonable, and Clara was pulling a frozen trough fitting apart with bare hands because she could not get the pipe wrench into the angle she needed while wearing gloves. The old woman had come through the fence line on foot from the neighboring parcel, which she farmed alone, or had farmed alone for many years, though she was somewhere in her middle 80s and moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned not to waste motion. She was Hungarian by birth, had come to this country with her husband 60 years earlier, had buried him here 30 years ago, and had been on her land ever since, in a way that suggested she and the land had reached a private understanding that did not require anyone else's interpretation. She watched Clara for a moment without speaking, then said, "The ground does not answer when you shout at it. You must ask it a question, and then stop talking long enough to hear the reply." Clara looked up from the frozen fitting and said she was not sure she was asking it anything yet. She was mostly just listening. The old woman considered this and nodded once, which was the highest endorsement she gave, and helped Clara get the fitting loose with a tactic involving leverage and the heel of her boot that Clara would not have arrived at alone. That was how the friendship began. Marta came by the following week with a jar of something fermented and dark that she said was for the soil and not for people. And she showed Clara how she had been treating her own pasture margins for 30 years with a biological amendment prepared from kitchen vegetable waste and a particular combination of local clays, a practice she had learned from her grandmother in Hungary and adapted here with a stubbornness she described as marital. She had stayed with it through the years when it looked like it wasn't working because she trusted the principle even when the evidence was slow. The principle, as she stated it, was this: the land has a memory longer than yours and shorter than you think, and if you feed it what it is missing, it remembers how to feed itself. Clara wrote this down, not in the notebook, but somewhere closer, the way you write down a thing that reorders the other things you know. That winter she began amending the soil along the pasture margins the way Marta had shown her, working the biological material into the ground in the late afternoons and covering it with the standing hay she had left in place in November, which was decomposing now in the way she had intended it to decompose, slowly and in contact with the soil rather than removed from it, breaking down into a layer of organic material that the ground had not had in 30 years of clean cutting. The boy came in February. His name was Tomas, and he was 10 years old, and he belonged to a family named Reyes, who rented the small house a half-mile down the road and whose father worked shifts at a fuel depot in the next town over. Tomas had the specific quality of watchfulness that some quiet children develop when they spend a lot of time observing adults and trying to figure out what is true among the things adults say, as opposed to what is merely convenient. He showed up at the fence line one afternoon while Clara was walking the property, and he asked her what she was looking at. She said she was looking at where the water went. He considered this and said he could tell her, because he had been watching the fields from the road for a long time, and the water from the ridge always went to the low corner by the third post and stayed there. She asked if he wanted to help her mark it. He did. He came back the next day and the day after that, and by the end of the week he was arriving in the afternoons with a small notepad of his own, in which he was keeping his own version of her records in a handwriting that was careful and serious, and she did not tell him to stop because it was accurate. The spring came and the pasture showed the first results of what she had been doing, which were subtle enough that you had to know what you were looking for. Along the margins where the amendment had been worked in, the grass was coming in thicker and a shade deeper green than the center sections. The drainage had changed in a way that Tomas confirmed with satisfaction. The low corner still received the runoff from the ridge, but it was holding it differently, the soil drawing it in rather than letting it sheet off into the road ditch, which meant the pasture was banking moisture that, in previous years, had been lost. Clara walked the property on a Tuesday morning in late April and felt, for the first time since she had arrived, that the ground was beginning to answer. She did not say this to anyone. She had learned in the extension years that the fastest way to lose credibility in a farming community was to make a claim about your land before the land had made it for you. The county extension agent came out in May to do a standard pasture assessment, the kind done on rotation for all hay operations in the valley, and he recorded the state of her fields with the careful neutrality of a man who had been trained not to express surprise on the job. He told her afterward, in the driveway, in a low voice that was not quite a whisper but aimed at the same effect, that what he was seeing in those margin sections was not typical for this parcel, and that he did not entirely know what she was doing, but that, whatever it was producing a grass density and root depth that the Tremblay land had not shown in the 15 years he had been rotating through. She thanked him. He drove away. She went inside and did the arithmetic on a yellow legal pad, the way she always did when she needed to think through a number. She estimated the additional yield the margin sections were likely to produce by the first cutting, compared it to the previous owner's recorded averages, and wrote at the bottom of the page a figure that made her sit very still for approximately 90 seconds. Then she folded the legal pad and put it in the drawer under the telephone, and did not mention it to anyone. The summer unrolled the way the sky had been telling her it would, if you were looking at the right things. She had been watching the cloud formations above the eastern ridge since January, and what she had noticed with increasing certainty through April and May was a pattern that Augustine Breer had once described to her as the signature of a blocking high that was setting up earlier than usual and farther west than typical, which was significant because of what it implied about summer precipitation. There would not be much. She had written this down in March. She had based her decisions on it in April. She had delayed her first cutting by 11 days past the date that the extension calendar recommended, watching the sky and the soil moisture rather than the calendar, and she had taken the cutting when the conditions were exactly right, and the windows were exactly right, and the hay had come in at a quality that Tomas had smelled and announced was different, which was not a rigorous assessment, but was not wrong either. Everyone else in the valley cut early. Dale Pritchard cut the earliest of anyone, the second week of May, because the forecast said dry and hot, and Dale Pritchard was the kind of man who prided himself on moving before the window closed. He got his tonnage in. He said so at the Watershed Association meeting, and he said so at the diner, and the general shape of his satisfaction was a thing you could see from across the room. The forecast continued to say dry and hot, which it was. The creek dropped. The second cutting came in thin across the valley. The third cutting was barely worth the fuel to run the equipment, and by the end of June, the county emergency coordinator was sending advisory notices about hay supply shortfalls, and people were doing the arithmetic of what they would owe in purchased feed through October against what they had in their accounts to pay for it, and the arithmetic was not comfortable. Clara had her first cutting stacked and covered. She had her second cutting going into the barn in late June. Her fields, sitting at the eastern margin of the valley, where the drainage off the ridge was feeding the moisture she had been banking in the soil since winter, were not performing like the valley floor fields. They were not immune to the drought. But the root depth she had been building for 8 months was reaching water that the shallow-rooted conventional stands could not reach. and the biological amendment had made the soil structure more retentive, and the grass that came up was coming up from deeper and holding longer than anyone watching from the road would have predicted was possible in these conditions. She did not advertise this. She put her head down and kept working and kept listening. The first person to come to her door was not Dale Pritchard. It was a woman named Suki Albright, who raised stocker calves on 60 acres, and who had always been neutral toward Clara in the particular way that some people are neutral when they lack the information to form a stronger opinion. She came on a Wednesday evening in early July with a casserole dish in her hands because she was from a generation that did not arrive empty-handed, and she said that she had heard Clara had some hay put up, and she was wondering, not to be forward, but she was wondering if there was any possibility of purchasing a small quantity because her calves were not going to make weight, if she couldn't find supplemental feed, and the brokers were charging prices that were not real prices, they were emergency prices, and she didn't know what else to do. Clara looked at her for a moment. She said to come inside, and they would talk about what she had and what Suki actually needed and whether it could be made to work. She sold Suki Albright enough hay to see her stocker calves through August at a price that was fair but not emergency fair, which is to say she charged market rate and not the gouging rate, and she recorded the transaction in the same notebook she had used for soil observations, because it was a data point of the same order. Martin Galt reappeared on a Thursday morning the following week. He was wearing the same canvas ranch coat, and he brought the same warm manner, and he had clearly done some arithmetic of his own. He said he had been in the area and thought he would check in, see how things were going, and he gestured at the fields with a casualness that he had assembled carefully and that did not quite hold its shape. He said High Plains Ag had been monitoring the drought situation county-wide, and that they were very concerned, naturally, about the stability of individual operations under these conditions, and he wondered if the circumstances had perhaps changed Clara's thinking about the consolidation offer he had mentioned in November. He named a new figure. It was $39,000, which was an increase of $5,000, and was still, if you knew what the first cutting had produced, and what the second was going to produce, and what that combination was worth in a drought market, an insult dressed as a favor. She said no. He pressed gently in the way he pressed, and he said that he understood she had some hay put up, but that a dry year like this one could go against even a well-positioned operator, and that High Plains Ag was able to provide security that individual operations simply could not provide for themselves. She looked at him for a long moment, and she said, "I appreciate you thinking of me." He drove away, and she stood in the yard and watched the dust settle, and she was aware of a particular quality of attention in the way he had looked at her fields, a precision in how he described her situation that went slightly beyond what a man merely concerned with regional drought conditions would need to know. Marta came by that afternoon, as she occasionally did, appearing through the fence line with the unannounced reliability of weather. She sat on the porch and accepted a glass of water, and Clara told her about Galt's visit and about the figure he had mentioned and about the precision of his knowledge. Marta was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When a man knows the exact weight of a thing he has not been invited to weigh, he has been watching through a window." She said it without drama, the way she said most things, and she went home. Clara stood on the porch after she left and looked at the fence line along the road and at the elevation of the ridge above, and she thought about what you could observe from where, and she thought about the county drought advisory notices that Galt's consortium surely received, and she thought about the casserole dish that Suki Albright had brought, and she thought that the shape of the next several weeks was becoming visible if you were paying attention, which she was. The July heat wave was a thing people in the valley would describe afterward in terms that made it sound almost personal, as though the weather had decided to make a particular argument. It arrived on a Monday, and it did not leave for 9 days, and the temperature on the valley floor reached 104 on the third day, and held near there for the rest of the week, and the creek bed was dry dust, and the cattle on the conventional hay operations were standing at feeders that were running empty faster than anyone could fill them. The co-op ran out of locally sourced hay in 4 days. The broker prices went to 3 times the normal rate, then higher. Dale Pritchard drove by Clara's place on a Tuesday of that week and saw her second cutting going into the barn, and he kept driving. But he came back on Thursday. He sat in his truck at the end of the driveway for a good 5 minutes before he came to the door, and when she opened it, he was holding his hat in both hands, which was something she had never seen him do, and he said, without preamble, that he had several hundred head of cattle, and that he was running out of feed, and that he had been wrong about her operation, and he was not a man who said that kind of thing easily, and he would like to purchase whatever quantity she could spare at whatever price she set. He said that last part the way a man says something that costs him considerably, and he meant it. She looked at him. She said, "You'll get the same price as everyone else who has asked." He blinked because he had expected something more elaborate, perhaps something that allowed him to feel he was being punished, and the plainness of it unsettled him more than a lecture would have. She brought him inside, and they sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open between them, and she sold him what she could responsibly spare, which was a substantial quantity, and she recorded it alongside Sukey Albright's transaction and 4 others that had come in between. The Watershed Association called an emergency meeting the following Tuesday, and Martin Galt was there. He had been at the previous meeting in June in an advisory capacity, representing High Plains Ag's regional interests, which included a feed storage facility 20 miles north that was, it turned out, holding a substantial reserve of purchased hay that had been moved in from out of state during the early drought weeks when prices were still manageable, before the emergency pricing had kicked in. He stood at the front of the meeting room, which was the grain co-op's back office with folding chairs set up in rows, and he described the situation in the valley in terms that were accurate as far as they went, and that offered, at the conclusion of his presentation, a solution. High Plains Ag was prepared to make its hay reserve available to valley operators through a feed cost sharing program, the terms of which involved a multi-year supply agreement that would lock participating operators into purchasing through High Plains Ag's network at rates to be set annually by the consortium. He presented this as relief. The people in the folding chairs looked tired and hot, and most of them were calculating whether they had any other option. Leon Hatter from the co-op board said it was worth discussing. Clara Voss was in the 3rd row. She had come because Marta had told her to come. Tomas had asked to come too, and she had brought him, and he was sitting beside her with his notepad on his knee. She listened to Galt's presentation, and she listened to the terms, and she did the arithmetic on a corner of Tomas's notepad while Galt was speaking, because the arithmetic was the kind of thing you needed to hold in your hand to understand its shape, and what she understood from it was that the multi-year supply agreement at consortium set rates would, over 5 years at reasonable drought recurrence probability, transfer a significant portion of every participating operation's margin to High Plains Ag. It was a structure designed to be accepted under pressure and resented under calm when it was too late. She wrote the number at the bottom of the page and showed it to Tomas, who looked at it with the gravity of someone who recognized a large number even without the context to fully interpret it. She put her hand up. She asked Galt what the current held inventory at the northern facility was, in tons. He said it was a proprietary figure. She said she understood that, but she was wondering if he could give a general range. He said it was adequate to the situation. She said she had heard that the facility was holding approximately 800 tons purchased in May at pre-drought prices, and she was wondering if that figure was in the right neighborhood. There was a particular quality of stillness that came over Galt's face, the stillness of a man recalculating very quickly, and he said that he could not confirm operational figures, but that the number she was describing was, in a general sense, not unreasonable. She said because she had been tracking hay supply and demand data for the county since April, which was her habit as an operator, and the reason she had brought it up was that the current emergency broker price for hay in the county, applied to 800 tons acquired at May cost, represented a margin of approximately 400%. And she wanted to make sure that the people in the room understood that the relief being offered was relief from a shortage that had been, in part, anticipated and positioned against by the same entity offering the relief, and that the terms of the supply agreement were the mechanism by which that positioning was to be made permanent. She said all of this in the same steady voice she used for everything, and she looked at Galt while she said it, and he looked back with an expression that had stopped doing the work of warmth. The room was very quiet. Leon Hatter cleared his throat. Dale Pritchard, who was in the back row, said, "How did you know about the 800 tons?" Galt said that he couldn't speak to where she was getting that information. Clara said that she had noticed during his November visit to her property and again during his July visit that he was able to describe her hay inventory with a precision that exceeded what a casual observer could have established from the road, and that she had subsequently made some inquiries through the county assessor's records and the co-op purchase logs, which were public, and through a conversation with the driver of a supply truck who had made deliveries to both her property and the northern facility, and that she was not accusing anyone of anything. She was simply providing context for a figure that Galt himself had called not unreasonable. The room did not move. Galt said this was a mischaracterization of a good faith effort to assist the community, and that he was surprised she would respond to a genuine offer of help with this kind of insinuation. She said she was not surprised at all, and she said it without heat. Then she told them what she had. She told them she had hay from 2 cuttings, stacked and covered, enough to provide meaningful supplemental feed to every operation in the immediate area that needed it between now and the end of September, which was the period she estimated before the weather pattern broke. She had been watching the clouds. She said this straightforwardly, without apology, because she had earned the right to say it. She said she would make this supply available to every operator who needed it at a single flat price per ton, a price she wrote on the sheet of paper Tomas was holding and which she asked him to carry to the front, which he did with the particular seriousness of a 10-year-old who understands that he has been trusted with something real. The price was fair. It was not the emergency price. It was the price that allowed her to remain solvent and to recoup the costs of the season without profiting from a catastrophe. She said that she asked only that people provide their own labor for transport, which most of them had the capacity to do, and that they record the transaction in the co-op log, so there was a fair accounting. Galt said that her quantity was not sufficient, which may have been true in the most technical sense, and that the community needed a sustainable solution, which was the language of someone whose actual solution had just been declined. Leon Hatter looked at his hands. Then he looked at Dale Pritchard. Dale Pritchard stood up from the back row, and he said, in the loud, carrying voice he used for everything, that he could make up any shortfall from a reserve he had found this week he had not known he had, which was not entirely accurate, but was the kind of thing a man says when he is trying to do the right thing after a long time of not doing it, and it was received in the spirit offered. 2 other operators said similar things. Galt remained at the front of the room for a moment longer, his position unchanged in the physical sense, and then he picked up the folder he had brought, and he left, not with any drama, but with the brisk, disappointed efficiency of someone who has failed at something he expected to succeed at and cannot think of a more useful response than leaving. The room was quiet for a long moment after the door closed. Then there was talking, the kind of talking that happens after a pressure releases, and people came to Clara with their numbers, and she wrote them down in the notebook, and they made their arrangements. And when it was finished and most people had gone, and Leon Hatter was folding up the chairs, he said to her, "I owe you an apology, I think, among other things, and she said that she thought what she needed from him was a fair working relationship with the co-op going forward, which was more useful than an apology, and he said he thought that was right. Marta came through the fence line the following Thursday, on a morning when the sky above the eastern ridge had a quality that Clara recognized from her records. The old woman stood in the pasture margin and looked at the grass coming back in the amended sections, the new growth putting up green against the dust pail of the valley floor, and she said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "The land has a memory longer than yours and shorter than you think." Clara said, "I heard that somewhere once." Marta looked at her with an expression that might have been amusement or satisfaction, or both. She said that the rains would come before the end of the month. Clara said she knew. She had seen it in the clouds. 3 days of easterly morning drift along the ridge line, the specific character of moisture building from a pattern she had been tracking since June, the angle of the light changing in the way it changed before a significant front came through. She had recorded it in the notebook on Monday. She had not said anything about it yet because she was still watching, and she had learned that the sky gave you the information and expected you to be patient with the timing. The rains came on a Sunday. Not a downpour, not a storm that erased itself in 2 hours, but a steady, quiet 3-day rain that refilled the creek to something recognizable, and sent water across the valley floor in slow sheets and soaked into ground that had been waiting for it since April. People stood in their doorways and watched it with the relief of people who had been holding a very specific kind of anxiety for a very long time, and were now being allowed to put it down. The valley greened again, slowly and unevenly, and the alfalfa that had looked like finished standing straw showed the first signs of recovery, and the cattle operations that had made it through the worst of July and August on supplemental feed began to look like they were going to be all right, which was not a sure thing and was worth noting. Tomas came to the fence line on the first day of the rain and stood there getting wet and looking at the pasture with a satisfaction that he expressed by writing a number in his notepad. The projected yield for the fall cutting, based on the root depth and moisture they had been building since winter. It was a number significantly larger than the previous owner's average. He showed it to Clara. She looked at it and nodded once, which was the highest endorsement she gave. She was in the pasture that evening in the last light, walking the margin sections and looking at what was happening in the soil, and she stopped at the corner where the drainage from the ridge came in and stood very still for a moment. The grass under her boots had a depth and a density that had not been there when she arrived, and the ground had a give to it that was different from the packed resistance of neglect. She had been here 11 months. She had paid $31,000 and 11 months of labor, and the kind of attention that most people thought was not worth giving to a piece of ground that everyone agreed was underperforming, and the ground had answered. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that announced itself to people standing at the roadside. In the way that things answer when they have been asked rather than commanded, which is to say gradually and then completely, and in a language that takes time to learn to hear. She walked back toward the house as the rain came on again, and she thought about Galt and his folder and his good boots, and she thought about Dale Pritchard holding his hat in both hands at her door, and she thought about Leon Hatter folding chairs and offering something better than an apology, and about Suki Albright's casserole dish, and about Marta coming through the fence line in the cold with a jar of biological amendment and a principle she had carried from another country and applied here with stubborn faith. She thought about Tomas and his notepad and the numbers he kept and the way he had carried the paper to the front of the room with the gravity of someone doing something important, which he had been. She went inside and put the kettle on and opened the notebook to the last page of entries and wrote the date and the rainfall amount and the soil moisture reading from the eastern margin, which was the highest she had recorded. She wrote it the way she wrote everything in the notebook, without comment, without decoration, as a fact that would speak for itself when someone needed it too. The ground does not answer when you shout at it. You must ask it a question and then stop talking long enough to hear the reply. She had asked it a question in September. It was answering still.